a new book out. It's called Suspicious Activity, and it's co-authored by Christopher Paulos, who's joining us now. This is, and I think it's fair to say, a legal thriller. You see it on the cover right there. Mike Papantonio and Christopher Paulos wrote this together, both of them steeped with knowledge in the law, with anti-terrorism, with litigating some of the largest cases against pharmaceutical companies. They look at government fraud. They have, between them, so much experience that they draw on to weave this tale that it's a fascinating read, and you learn a lot along the way. How about it for Christopher Paulos? Look at you, sir. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
Very well, sir. Thank you. Let me just explain who you are. I normally don't, read word for word, but there's so much here. Attorney and partner at the Levin Pampantonio. It's Levin Pampantonio Rafferty. Those are the partners in the firm in which you're operating.
That's right.
And you litigate some of the largest and most complex pharmaceutical, medical device, environmental mass torts, as well as government fraud, federal False Claim Act cases. With the San Diego County Public Defender's Office and in private practice, you have handled matters involving organized crime, drug trafficking, and sophisticated fraud. Now, you lead the firm's counterterrorism litigation team, spearheading some of the country's most cutting-edge cases, holding those who commit and support terrorism wherever they may be found accountable for their heinous acts. That's what's in your bio, and I just wanted to make sure it all got out because I feel as though there's a lot there. Now let me just speak to how some of that, and then you can really contextualize it for us. But I learned a lot in this book, and one of the things I learned about was these IEDs, and the whole thing, and the tale involves banking and money laundering and all this stuff. But the thing that jumped out right away that I just didn't know about was there are different kinds of these IEDs and EFPs, and the EFPs are particularly brutal. I wonder if you could just start with talking about this, and then I'll get into the court case and a little bit of the yarn itself, please.
Absolutely. Well, the book Suspicious Activity focuses on a particular type of EFP that was being used in Iraq and Afghanistan against U.S. troops and coalition troops. And the explosively formed penetrator is what the acronym EFP stands for. And those were IEDs that started to be used against our troops in Iraq sometime in about early to mid 2004. And they were essentially game changers in terms of the insurgency that started to blossom in Iraq at that time. They're highly sophisticated explosive devices that take a very expert knowledge to create and then to actually successfully deploy with lethal effect. And it turns out that those types of improvised explosive devices were developed by Hezbollah in the late 90s. And ended up being seen in the battlefield in Iraq because of the Hezbollah and Iranian connection to some of the militant groups that were targeting and attacking coalition forces at the time. Those types of IEDs are exponentially more lethal and more effective in penetrating certain types of armor and overcoming counter IED contingency devices that our troops had. And they are, the numbers have shifted, particularly in hindsight, but at least 700 of our troops were killed by explosively formed penetrators specifically, and many more by the groups that were receiving that type of material support from state and non-state actors.
One of the things that, there's so many things that you lay out in your book that are so instructive and learning so much just by looking at some of the facts that you weave into the story. One of the things I learned is something that you just referenced, which is that it seems for every technology that the insurgency has, like the terrorist insurgency has, these IEDs, for example, we come up with, that is the Americans, the fighting force there in Iraq, come up with some way to either handle it, anticipate it, etc. But with these EFPs, as you just said, they're so much more lethal and destructive, and you actually go into you break down what happens with these things. And as you've just noted, there really isn't a way to anticipate them the way you could the IEDs.
Yeah, the sophistication of the EFP, the triggering mechanisms, and the various ways that those evolved in order to defeat our counter IED defeat techniques were incredibly nefarious, very sophisticated, and it was the only reason that was achievable on the ground in Iraq against our troops is because of an enormous amount of both monetary but expertise support, having access to the military-grade plastic explosives that were used to power an EFP, the types of metals that are used to actually mill to very tight specifications, the tolerances required to make the warheads in those types of weapons. It's almost a misnomer, an improvised explosive device, because these things were very purposefully built. They weren't improvised. They weren't just cooked up in someone's garage. They were expertly created and then frighteningly expertly distributed throughout the whole of Iraq to be used against our troops.
And now to then that nexus of those things, what you just alluded to, the amount of expertise, the supplies needed, the way in which you'd have to ramp up production would be expensive. Can you speak now to the banking connection and the way that these awful things are linked, sadly, to banks around the world?
Yeah, this is what we go into in our book, is that in order to basically launch a campaign of terror, particularly with EFPs against U.S. troops or other sophisticated trained military targets, you need to have an enormous amount of supply chain in terms of money, in terms of access to personnel willing to plant and replace these IEDs, to make the IEDs. The military grade explosives are expensive, the copper is expensive, the payment along the chain of distribution is expensive. And then just access to those materials is difficult to do, particularly if you're a group that's being targeted and hunted around the globe. And so you have to have an infrastructure available to you. And one of the key components of that infrastructure for any terrorist organization is going to be the financial component. You need to be able to move money around. You need to be able to access funds. And you need to be able to access goods or materials that you shouldn't be able to access. And that's often done with the complicity of financial institutions, whether it be transferring money or giving you letters of credit or access to trade finance transactions to access goods or materials that you need to run your organization to commit terrorism.
And that's something that you talk about in the book. So it's a fictitious bank in the book, but I wonder if you can speak to, in real life, though, this is all informed by real life, and it's compelling for that reason, I think, among others. Can you speak to the real life part of this, and then maybe, you have sort of just touched on it, but I wonder if you can. I'll ask the point blank: are there American banks involved in terrorism and the somehow laundering or handling money for, even if it's on down the chain, for groups that are associated with terrorism?
Absolutely. There are banks in the United States. They're global financial institutions with branches and subsidiaries here in the United States, often in and around New York, where it's one of the global financial epicenters, with correspondent banking branches there in New York. First and foremost, terrorism is a business and run as a business by those who lead those organizations, and the currency of choice is the dollar. And so to access U.S. currency, to have sophisticated global transactions take place, you need to usually run through a correspondent bank here in the United States. So the people, places, and events of our book are fictitious, but they're based on real life situations that have been admitted to by banks in some circumstances, that are the results of prosecutions done by the Department of Justice, or are similar to the fact patterns that we see in the cases that we handle on the civil side, representing those victims of terrorism who are seeking to hold the infrastructure of terrorism accountable.
In your book, you have, the sort of a similar parallel. I associate your real life with a little bit of what's going on in the book. You have the investigators, the legal side, the lawyer, investigator, and investigator. I'm really curious. So I hate to keep kind of getting you back to real life, but if you can just give me a sense for how these discoveries that you made along the way with terrorism aided by U.S. banks and these sort of moments of, oh my God, how they played out in your own life, in your own investigations, because you've been involved in this for quite some time.
Absolutely. A good example from our book is that Deke, the main lawyer character that was developed by Mike Papantonio in his series of books, becomes aware of this type of case through a whistleblower, through an insider in the bank who happens to also be a U.S. veteran service member, and with some expertise in explosive ordnance disposal. And that is how the lawyer in that book becomes aware of it. In real life, we often receive information like that from somebody who's within an institution or within an organization that sees something happening, has tried to run it up the chain of command, and is either retaliated against or sent to corporate Siberia, and then reaches out to an attorney to see what their rights and how are and how they can be protected in reporting that information. With a lot of the banking the information about banks being involved in terrorism, certainly after 9/11, the role of the financial sector in terrorism became, I think, much more apparent. There were many laws that were passed that tried to stamp out the financial flow of terrorism. But at the same time, those laws put our banks at the front lines of preventing terrorism. Banks are in a unique position to report suspicious activities within their accounts so that terrorism can be stopped and that money can be prevented from flowing into the wrong hands. And what we've seen both in the headlines and also in our book is that banks often get to a crossroads and choose the wrong path. That is to become more complicit or knowledgeable, turn a blind eye to illicit activities because it's generating so many profits for them. And that's certainly something that we've seen in real life.
And the other thing that you touch on is the way in which there are outside interests, even Iranian interests, that are using domestic handmaidens here in this country to do a lot of the stuff that they need to do in this country.
Yeah, certainly. I think a lot of people who are paying attention to the headlines every day understand that there are outside state actors that have an interest in the inner workings of our country and our government, the trajectory of our country, and are doing things through technologies to have an influence on that. The banking industry is certainly no exception. It is just as digital as any other current technology, and there are ways that it can be manipulated, or certain safeguards can be defeated through expert techniques in structuring transactions. And that's really one of the centerpieces of the story in our book, is how certain things that banks were basically deputized to do can actually then be used by those who are supposed to be the watchdog to allow certain folks to get around those safeguards. And so it's unfortunately something that folks get very sophisticated at, and then almost just like the IED situation, where something then doesn't start to doesn't work any longer, or they get caught doing something, they simply just evolve their techniques to make it easier to keep the pipeline open.
I have a question from one of our viewer listeners. Robert says, can the financial transactions be predicted, or is it just determined after the fact? Yeah, I wonder about that.
Well, I think the ways in which transactions can be structured are predictable. It's a system that has certain ways that transactions can be layered or disguised, but the suspicious activity reports, and that's where the title of our book comes from, is that banks have an obligation to report suspicious activity. they also have an obligation to know their customer and to actually know the beneficiaries of the accounts that they have. And they know their customers better than anybody. And they certainly have the ability to predict how their own systems and how their procedures at their bank can be used for terrorism. And they most certainly shouldn't be teaching people who could use how to get around those safeguards that they've implemented and are deputized to police themselves. But that's what we've seen. We've seen that banks have actually created departments that are designed to handle, quote unquote, their high risk accounts, and that those departments charge premiums for them to be able to conduct transactions without being screened by OFAC or other financial watchdogs or flagged as suspicious. And so being able to predict a transaction, we know what terrorists need money for. We know how they've used the financial system in the past, but we're always trying to play catch up. They're always trying to, basically, seal a leak in the dam, so to speak. And when you put your finger in one crack, it starts to squirt out another one. So it's a little bit of whack-a-mole.
It's interesting, though, when you talk about the fact that the banks have a kind of fork in the road and they make the decision to take the route that may be the mistake. Josh points out they have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors. And that's kind of what you've sort of implied with your answer, which is, and that's exactly why they make these decisions, because they're the money-making decision as opposed to the responsible decision.
Absolutely. And in some of the Senate investigations that took place in the later 2000s, particularly the HSBC banking investigation, the headlines really dealt with more cartel money, but they were doing this exact same thing for terrorist organizations like Hezbollah. And they essentially make that calculation. In the documents that were released to those investigations, you see them talking about the potential for reputational harm and risk. And that's exactly what they're talking about in those emails, is they are weighing the threat to their bottom line on whether or not they'll get caught doing what they're doing, knowing that they're the ones that are hiding it, and the money that they're going to be making from handling those types of transactions.
Wow. It's just, it's brutal. It's just as was just posted on the screen from one of our viewers. The banks must know this. Yeah, they, on some level they do. And it's.
Yeah, and they have a duty to know it. They have taken the position that they will assist in stamping out terrorism and drug trafficking and human trafficking, and not allow their banks to be used for these types of illicit activities. And so it's a conscious decision for them to do what they're doing.
You are suing Iran.
That's correct.
The idea is that Iran created these EFPs. They're these brutal, IEDs and EFPs. I love the point you made, which is improvised makes it sound kind of like it was just slapped together in, somebody's hut. But the reality is it's super sophisticated and super destructive. And in your book, you have the sweet souls who've been, damaged by these things. And it's discussed explicitly, and you also meet them. You see the faces of some of the people in real life. I understand the book is, a fictional account. Anyway, you're suing Iran for these things, and I'm wondering how that works. Can you just give us, I know it's probably super complicated, but can you give us a sense of how that works?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. So first you have to start with that from the get-go, a foreign sovereign nation is usually immune to the US laws. And there's what is called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act that says that another foreign country is immune from suit in the United States. But there are 5 exceptions. And one of those exceptions is terrorism, and specifically for state sponsors of terrorism that are designated through executive order and other executive branch procedures. So for state sponsors of terrorism, if they either commit an act of extrajudicial killing, a hostage taking, airline hijacking, certain enumerated acts, if they either commit those acts or provide material support to those acts, they no longer enjoy the benefit of sovereign immunity within the United States court system or judicial system. And so U.S. victims of terror can seek justice through our courts if they are victims of terrorism that was materially supported by a state sponsor of terror, such as Iran. And so with that, our courts will strip Iran of its immunity and allow victims of terror to proceed into litigation with their cases. So that's kind of the procedural mechanism that allows us to bring those types of lawsuits.
And then going through the actual process of getting Iranian money is associated with freezing assets, knowing where their assets are, and then getting those assets to essentially handle the complaint once their judgment's made, to handle the judgment.
Yeah, that's correct. So Iran strategically takes a default in these cases, and I liken it to it's additional terrorism on top of their terrorism. If the United States sues an oil tanker or seizes a bank or is a commercial or contractual dispute, Iran will show up in court every day, and they will defend itself, and they will vigorously litigate those cases. But they gaslight victims of terrorism, and they rob victims of terrorism the opportunity to conduct discovery against it directly, to depose and take testimony of those that may have harmed them or been involved in the decisions and the actions that led to certain terrorist attacks or the support of certain groups. And so what usually will end up happening is that we do conduct discovery against non-parties, third parties, and others that have potential evidence. That often includes the government, Department of Defense, Department of State as well. And we build the case brick by brick without Iran there. The Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act doesn't just allow you to, if they don't show up, you don't get an automatic judgment. That actually puts the federal judge that's overseeing that case in the seat as the fact finder. And the statute says expressly that your evidence has to prove every element of your claim to the satisfaction of that judge. And so you will get a full judicial review of the evidence available to you to see if you can establish your claim against Iran, at which point, if you do, they will enter judgment. You can use that judgment to execute writs of execution or to seek writs of execution against assets around the globe. And recently, fairly recently, in 2015, the United States government set up what's called the United States Victim of State-Sponsored Terror Fund, where a judgment holder, that is a victim of terrorism with a judgment against a state sponsor of terror, can apply to that fund to have a portion of their judgments repaid. And that fund has made 4 payments to date. It's funded by the actual civil and criminal penalties that are realized through our government's prosecution of violations of the International Economic Powers Act and sanctions. So there's a lot in the news these days about Russian sanctions and certain sanctions being placed on individuals, organizations, and those things. So if the U.S. government, Department of Justice, prosecutes, let's just say, somebody who makes radio transceivers that end up in roadside bombs, and they successfully prosecute that company or the individual doing that, and they obtain a civil or criminal penalty through those efforts, a certain portion, a large portion, majority of that money is supposed to go to the fund. There's been some situations where the DOJ may, have made a questionable decision about whether or not the funds go to the fund, but those monies fund the fund, and when there is sufficient amount of money in the fund, those claims can be paid. So it used to be 20, 30 years ago that these default judgments or judgments obtained against either the terrorist organizations themselves or state sponsor of terror were much harder for victims to actually see some compensation that could potentially make them whole. That's how our justice system works. Is we can't bring anybody back. We can't, give anybody a new arm or leg like they had before, but we can at least try to give them compensation to make their lives better and as whole as they could possibly be. So
yeah, and Iran cares about that money. So, but that's why those sanctions matter. They don't want assets freezed, and it's a look. You're the guy on this. I'm glad we touched on it because you're literally. I was looking. You're the foremost legal expert on suing Iran for terrorist attacks and using these devices, these IEDs and EFPs, and getting the people who were maimed by these things some kind of compensation. As you say, it doesn't right or wrong, but it's a remarkable world, and I just didn't honestly know about it. I mean, to the extent that you discuss it and then you weave it into this yarn, and it's really great, Chris. Congratulations on this book, and I guess you've done it with Mike Pompantonio, who is an experienced. both writer and lawyer as well, right?
Absolutely. This book is just one of several that Mike has published that is essentially based on our experiences. Is fictionalized for the everyday reader to kind of understand the types of legal issues that law firms like mine are handling every day. And we, I believe we're putting them out so that folks can understand what's actually going on in the world in a fictional setting, and be a little bit more aware of how our legal system can be used for the better.
Unreal. Good luck with the book. Congratulations again. It's Suspicious Activity. We'll drop this as a separate video. We'll have a link to the book and to places to buy the book. And we wish you all the best with it. Really fascinating conversation. I'd love for you to come back sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Christopher Paulos. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.